There is an ancient capital in Europe that you cannot visit. Its streets still exist. Its walls still hold the shape of a royal city. Houses, courtyards, public buildings, and the palace of a king remain where they were left more than 23 centuries ago. But no road leads there. No visitor walks its streets. Because the city lies beneath dark water. Archaeologists found it in 1948. They mapped it, excavated it, photographed it, and then watched the modern world close over it beneath a reservoir. Its name was Seuthopolis, and it belonged to a civilization that once stood between Greece, Persia, Macedonia, the Danube, and the Black Sea. A world rich enough to bury its rulers with gold, powerful enough to alter the calculations of Athens and Macedon, and elusive enough that much of its own voice has vanished. This was Thrace. But almost immediately, the name creates a problem.
There was no single Thrace, in the way there was a single Roman state. To Greek writers, Thracians was a broad name for many peoples living across an immense and shifting region north of the Aegean and through the eastern Balkans. Their communities occupied lands that today lie mainly within Bulgaria, northern Greece, European Turkey, and neighboring regions toward the lower Danube. No permanent capital united them. No single dynasty commanded them all. Nor did one political system govern the entire region. Some traded with one another. Some fought one another. Some followed powerful kings. Others guarded their independence. Yet to outsiders, they could still belong to the larger world called Thracian. So the phrase, "the lost kingdom of Thrace," conceals a more complicated reality. There were many Thracian worlds.
And for a time, one royal house managed to bind enough of them together to create the most formidable Thracian state known to history, the Odrysian Kingdom. Herodotus sensed the paradox. Writing in the 5th century BCE, he claimed that the Thracians were, after the Indians, the most numerous people known to him. He added that if they could ever unite under one ruler, they would be almost impossible to overcome. That is not a population statistic we can verify. It is the judgment of a Greek author, not a modern census. But the political idea behind it is revealing. Thrace possessed scale. Its weakness was fragmentation. And less than a century after the Persian invasions of Greece, the Odrysian kings would come closer than anyone before them to turning that scattered strength into power. Yet every reconstruction of Thrace begins with an absence. A king survives as a name cut into metal or stone. A ceremony survives as paint on the wall of a tomb. A language survives in fragments. The Thracians left no surviving continuous history written in their own language. Their language belonged to the Indo-European family, but today it is known only through personal names, place names, short inscriptions, and isolated words preserved by others. No Thracian historian tells us how a king justified a war. No native chronicle explains a royal succession. No surviving text leads us through a ritual and tells us what every gesture meant to the people performing it. Instead, most of the written story comes from Greeks and Romans, and they were never neutral spectators.
They traded with Thracians, fought them, hired them, feared them, married into ruling families, borrowed from their culture, mocked them as outsiders, and transformed the lands beyond the northern Aegean into a setting for myth. Their testimony is indispensable. It is also partial. So the reconstruction has to begin somewhere else as well, beneath the soil. Across the Balkans, archaeologists have uncovered fortified settlements, royal centers, weapons, horse equipment, inscriptions, sanctuaries, painted tombs, and extraordinary objects in gold and silver. A wall can reveal how a settlement was defended. A harness fitting can expose the social importance of the horse. A painted chamber can preserve a ceremony after the names of everyone inside it have disappeared. None of these discoveries can replace the lost Thracian voice, but together they overturn the old caricature of Thrace as nothing more than a wild frontier beyond Greece. The historical Thracians did not suddenly appear on one date. Archaeology shows long regional development across the Bronze and Iron Age Balkans, together with contacts reaching towards the Aegean, Anatolia, the lower Danube, and the steppe. How the peoples later described as Thracian emerged remains debated. There was no single morning when an entire population woke up and chose one name. By the early 1st millennium BCE, however, Greek writers were identifying numerous communities in southeastern Europe as Thracian, and the land they inhabited shaped nearly everything that followed. Mountain ranges broke the country into valleys and made local power difficult to uproot. Rivers opened routes from the interior toward the coast. Forests supplied timber. Pastures supported horses. Mineral-rich districts offered gold, silver, copper, and iron. Then there were the great corridors, the Hebros, now the Maritsa, the Strymon, the Lower Danube, the Western Black Sea, the Bosporus, and the Hellespont. Control even part of this landscape, and you stood beside some of the busiest passages between Europe and Asia. Thrace was not hidden at the edge of the ancient world. It was in the way. Its geography created wealth, and wealth attracts attention. From roughly the 7th century BCE onward, Greek settlements flourished around the northern Aegean and the western Black Sea. Abdera, Apollonia Pontica, Mesembria, and other cities joined an expanding maritime network. An older version of the story made the map look simple. Greeks on the coast, Thracians inland. The real frontier was far more crowded. Merchants negotiated. Rulers demanded privileges or tribute. Families crossed cultural boundaries. Pottery, weapons, wine, livestock, timber, grain, metals, ideas, and fashions moved in both directions. Conflict existed, but so did dependence. At Pistyros, deep inside Thrace, archaeology and an important inscription reveal a trading community connected to Greek merchants operating under Thracian rulers. The text preserves arrangements protecting commercial rights and obligations. For a moment, the machinery of exchange becomes visible. Wine and fine pottery moved inland. Grain, timber, livestock, metals, and other resources moved toward the coast. Greek craftsmen could work for Thracian patrons. Thracian elites could adopt Mediterranean forms without ceasing to be Thracian. A cup could cross a border. An idea could travel with it. And a ruler who understood both could become richer. This is why the familiar Greek division between Greek and barbarian can mislead us. Greek speakers used barbaros for people whose language was not Greek, and Athenian art and drama could portray Thracians as exotic, rough, or dangerous outsiders. Yet the same Athens employed Thracian soldiers, negotiated with Thracian kings, recognized the cult of the Thracian goddess Bendis, and depended on political and economic relationships in the north. The boundary was real, but it was porous, more marketplace than wall. Still, Greek imagination created another Thrace, a northern land of dangerous kings, fierce warriors, ecstatic religion, and mythic distance. Greek tradition placed Orpheus in Thrace and connected the region strongly with Dionysian stories. Centuries later, those associations would inspire elaborate theories about Thracian spirituality. This is where the historian has to slow down. Orpheus is a mythic figure, not a documented Thracian historical person. And what scholars call Orphic religion belongs to a complicated group of Greek world traditions whose relationship to actual Thracian beliefs remains debated. The silence of the evidence can be seductive. Where the record is incomplete, certainty is easy to invent. But Thrace does not need invention to become dramatic. Around 513 BCE, during the reign of Darius I, the armies of the Achaemenid Empire crossed into Europe as part of a campaign towards the Scythian lands. For Thrace, the horizon suddenly widened. Persian power reached into the region. Royal Achaemenid inscriptions later listed Scudra, a name associated with Thrace and neighboring territories, among the lands of the Great King. The precise reach and administrative form of Persian authority are still debated. It would be misleading to imagine every Thracian community governed in the same way or controlled with the same intensity. But parts of the southern Balkans now lay inside the strategic orbit of the largest empire of its age. Persian armies moved along routes through Thrace because those routes led toward the Straits, Macedonia, and Greece. The lesson was obvious. Whoever controlled these corridors could influence worlds far beyond the Balkans. Persia understood the value of those corridors. Macedon would exploit them next. Rome would eventually turn the same geography into part of an imperial system. Then, after the Greco-Persian Wars, Persian power in European Thrace receded. The imperial shadow withdrew, and in the political space that followed, one Thracian people rose above the others, the Odrysians. Their first major ruler known to us was Thrace. Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BCE, remembered him as the man who established the great Odrysian realm. But even here, the word founder can deceive. Thrace did not create a kingdom out of an empty landscape. He appears to have built a new level of royal authority over communities and local elites that already possessed their own leaders, loyalties, and traditions. That arrangement made the kingdom flexible. It also made it fragile. The Odrysian state was not a centralized nation-state in the modern sense. Royal power depended on personal loyalty, tribute, diplomacy, marriage alliances, gifts, military force, and relationships with regional rulers. Some communities remained outside direct control. Others could shift allegiance. A strong king could pull the web tight and expand rapidly. A weak center could watch the same web tear apart. The royal court drew wealth inward and pushed rewards outward. Tribute arrived from dependent peoples. Gifts passed between kings and aristocrats. Horses, precious vessels, textiles, land, status, and access to the ruler became instruments of politics. Power had to be seen, and because so much authority was personal, the king had to perform many roles at once: warrior, negotiator, judge, patron, marriage broker, distributor of wealth. He had to make loyalty feel profitable and disloyalty dangerous. Under Thrace, and especially under his son Sitalces, that system expanded dramatically. Suddenly, the northern kingdom was no longer a distant concern. It was a major player in Greek politics. When the Peloponnesian War began, in 431 BCE, Athens cultivated an alliance with Sitalces. The reason lay partly on the map. Thrace stood beside the routes linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, and Athens depended heavily on access through that wider northern world. Then, in 429 BCE, Sitalces moved. Thucydides describes a vast force assembled from many Thracian peoples and allies. Ancient army numbers are notoriously difficult to verify, and his figures should not be treated as a modern military register. But the political fact behind the description is remarkable. Sitalces could summon fighting men from across a far-reaching political network and lead them beyond the heartland of his kingdom. For weeks, the army advanced through Macedonia and the Chalcidic region. Communities watched it approach. Opponents often avoided open confrontation. The threat alone changed behavior. Then winter began to close in. The army that had made communities hesitate before confronting it encountered a quieter enemy: distance, time, and supply. Food became harder to maintain. The Athenian support Sitalces expected did not materialize as planned. The season was turning against him. After roughly a month, he withdrew. The campaign did not destroy Odrysian power. It revealed its boundaries. Sitalces could summon men across an enormous political network and carry that force into Macedonia. But every additional day in the field demanded food, movement, coordination, and loyalty across long distances. He had demonstrated extraordinary reach. Logistics exposed the limit of that reach. And that contrast matters, because the same kingdom that could not keep such a vast force campaigning indefinitely could still dazzle the Greek world with its wealth. Thucydides reports that under Sitalces' successor, Seuthes I, annual tribute reached about 400 talents in gold and silver, with gifts of roughly comparable value flowing to the court. Converting that number directly into modern money would create false precision. Ancient economies do not translate cleanly into ours, but the impression left by the source is unmistakable. The Odrysian monarchy was regarded as extraordinarily rich, and in Thrace, wealth did not simply disappear into vaults. It moved. A king collected treasure and redistributed treasure. A noble who received a magnificent vessel A fine horse, a weapon, land, or privileged access to the court received more than property. He received a place in the hierarchy. That made the banquet more than a meal. It became political theatre. Imagine a hall lit by flame. Metal catches the light. A cup changes hands. Everyone notices who sits closest to the ruler, who is invited forward, who receives a gift, who is left waiting. Archaeology has preserved the objects that made such performances possible. Thracian elite culture produced some of the most extraordinary metalwork in ancient Europe. Gold and silver wreather, cups, fireli, jewelry, decorated armor, and elaborate horse trappings. Their imagery resists simple labels. Some pieces use scenes familiar from Greek myth. Some display artistic elements connected with Achaemenid Persia. Others combine forms and motifs in ways that make sense only within the local world of Thracian elites. For a long time, cultures beyond the Greek city-states were sometimes described as if they merely copied a more advanced center. The metalwork refuses that hierarchy. It shows selection, adaptation, competition, and invention. Thracian elites participated in an international language of luxury, then bent that language toward their own politics. The Panagyurishte Treasure is one of the most spectacular surviving examples. Found in Bulgaria in 1949, it consists of 9 gold vessels, generally dated to the late 4th or early 3rd century BCE. The identity of their original owner has never been established. Scholars still discuss the workshops responsible for individual pieces, but the craftsmanship is beyond dispute. Human faces emerge from gold. Animal forms become vessels. Mythological figures crowd polished surfaces. Drinking equipment becomes sculpture. Seen behind museum glass, the objects are beautiful. Seen in the world that created them, they were active. Gold reflected fire. Hands lifted it. Eyes followed it. A feast could display an entire political hierarchy without a single formal proclamation. Then the scene shifts from the drinking hall to the open landscape, because behind the gold stood another mark of power, the horse. Ancient sources and archaeology both connect Thracian elites strongly with horsemanship. Thracian cavalry served in neighboring armies, and richly outfitted horse equipment appears prominently in elite contexts. The association was military, social, and symbolic. A mounted aristocrat could move quickly through difficult country. He could display wealth in public. He could transform the distance between settlements into an advantage. Thracian light infantry also became famous in the Greek world. The pelta, a light shield closely associated with Thracian fighters in Greek imagery and terminology, gave its name to the peltast. And this changed more than vocabulary. The popular image of Greek warfare is the hoplite phalanx. Heavy shields, spears, dense ranks, two forces colliding head-on. The terrain of the northern Aegean did not always reward that kind of battle. Hills, broken ground, and distance favored mobility. Light troops could approach, harass, withdraw, return, and force heavily equipped opponents to fight on unfamiliar terms. Thracian soldiers were not background figures in somebody else's military history. In Greek warfare, troops of this kind were becoming increasingly important, and Thracian peltasts were among their most famous practitioners. But while Thracian warriors influenced the armies around them, the political map at home was becoming more unstable. By the 4th century BCE, rival dynasts competed for influence. Greek coastal cities defended their interests. Athens still watched the north closely. Then one Odrysian king, Seuthes I, restored a formidable degree of royal authority. For a moment, the kingdom tightened again, and then the ruler vanished. Around 360 BCE, Seuthes was assassinated. The realm fractured. Several rulers competed over pieces of the Odrysian inheritance. And just beyond the western horizon, another monarchy was rising with extraordinary speed. Macedon. Philip II did not need to be told why Thrace mattered. He saw the roots, the coastal approaches, the mineral wealth, the strategic space between Macedonia and the Black Sea. Expanding east could weaken Athenian influence, while strengthening his own kingdom.
During the 350s and 340s BCE, Philip intervened repeatedly in Thracian affairs, secured strategic settlements, and pushed Macedonian power across much of the northern Aegean.
By about 341 to 340 BCE, the principal Odrysian kingdoms of southern Thrace had been defeated or subordinated. It sounds like an ending. It was not. Macedonian control was uneven. Local rulers survived. Thracian warriors entered Macedonian armies. Political independence contracted, but Thracian society did not disappear. Then Alexander the Great crossed into Asia in 334 BCE. Among the forces moving east were soldiers from the Balkans, including Thracians. History had turned on itself. Roughly 2 centuries earlier, Persian armies had crossed Thracian territory on their way toward Greece. Now men from Thrace marched with the army that would destroy the Achaemenid Empire. But Alexander's conquests created a new problem. What happens when an empire expands faster than the political system holding it together? In 323 BCE, Alexander died in Babylon. Almost immediately, his empire began to fracture. And in Thrace, a king emerged whose name would survive in bronze, inscriptions, stone, and a city beneath water. Seuthes III. He challenged the authority of Lysimachus, one of Alexander's successors, and established a royal center bearing his own name, Seuthopolis. The city marked the transformation. Earlier, Odrysian kings had ruled without a permanent monumental capital, comparable to the major urban centers of the Greek world. Seuthopolis was different. Founded in the late 4th century BCE, it was planned. Fortifications enclosed streets, houses, public spaces, and a royal complex. Its architecture belonged to the Hellenistic age. Greek appears in its inscriptions, but calling it simply a Greek city would miss the point. Its ruler was Thracian. It functioned as a royal center associated with Seuthes and his court. And its urban language belonged to a larger Hellenistic world, in which societies from Egypt to Central Asia were absorbing, combining, and reshaping cultural forms on an enormous scale. Seuthopolis was not proof that Thracian identity had vanished. If anything, it shows how identity can adapt without becoming empty. A Thracian king could rule from a planned Hellenistic city and still remain a Thracian king. Then Seuthopolis disappeared. Not once, twice. Eventually, the ancient city vanished from living memory. Its remains lay hidden beneath the soil until modern dam construction exposed them in 1948. Archaeologists suddenly found themselves racing a 20th century engineering project. They excavated streets, buildings, fortifications, the royal center. They recovered the plan of a city that history had forgotten. Then the reservoir filled. The ruins disappeared beneath the waters of what is now the Koprinka Reservoir in central Bulgaria. A royal capital had returned to history only to become physically unreachable again. Today, one of the clearest archaeological windows into Thracian kingship is still there, underwater. But Seuthes himself may have surfaced elsewhere. In 2004, archaeologists excavating the great mound of Golyama Kosmatka near Shipka uncovered a monumental complex strongly associated with Seuthes III. In front of the entrance lay a bronze head. Even in photographs, the face is difficult to forget. The eyes were created from inserted materials. The skin is modeled with remarkable sensitivity. Hair and beard are rendered with controlled detail. Above all, the face is strikingly individualized. It does not feel remote or anonymous. It looks startlingly human, almost present. The archaeological context and inscribed objects strongly connect the monument with Seuthes III, and the bronze portrait is widely identified with him. Scholars, however, continue to debate aspects of the monument's precise history and ritual use. That uncertainty matters, because a mystery does not become stronger when uncertainty is erased. It becomes weaker. For a civilization so often described through the voices of outsiders, the bronze head changes the emotional distance. Suddenly, Thrace has a face, and the burial mounds around it open another archive. Across ancient Thrace, elite funerary landscapes were marked by tumuli, artificial hills rising over valleys and plains.
Some concealed stone-built chambers. Some appear to have remained places of ritual activity after the original burial. Many were robbed in antiquity. Others survived. And every chamber that survived could preserve something no Greek historian ever thought to describe. A garment fastening, a painted wall, a horse harness, a name, a ritual arrangement, a trace of a political world otherwise invisible. Near Kazanlak, burial mounds crowd the landscape. Modern researchers have documented hundreds across the wider region, helping inspire the modern name Valley of the Thracian Kings. The name is modern, the hills are not. One tomb near Kazanlak, dating to around the end of the 4th century BCE, preserves one of the masterpieces of Hellenistic painting in the Balkans. A narrow corridor leads inward. The light diminishes. Then the walls begin to move. Horsemen, attendants, a chariot. Figures gathered around a scene often interpreted in connection with funerary ritual and feasting. The identities of the people buried there remain unknown. The meaning of every gesture cannot be recovered with certainty. But the paintings show an elite world in which memory was carefully staged. Horses mattered. Procession mattered. Feasting mattered. Status followed the dead into stone. Farther north, near Sveshtari, another tomb creates a completely different atmosphere. Built in the 3rd century BCE and associated with the Getae, whom ancient writers regarded as Thracian, its central chamber contains 10 remarkable female figures, carved in high relief. Their upper bodies are human. Below, they dissolve into stylized vegetal forms. They are unlike anything else known from Thracian lands, and no surviving ancient text tells us exactly who or what they represent. That silence is not a flaw in the story. It is part of the story. Beautiful images invite beautiful explanations. History demands restraint.
The same is true of Thracian religion. Greek authors mention gods and practices, but they often translated foreign belief through Greek categories. Bendis can be identified with confidence as a Thracian goddess whose cult was formally established at Athens. Greek tradition also connected Dionysus strongly with Thrace. The Getae became famous in Greek accounts for beliefs linked to Zalmoxis and immortality. But what did a Thracian farmer believe in one valley? What did an aristocrat believe 2 centuries later in another? What did local ritual mean to the people performing it? A complete reconstruction is impossible. The religious landscape was probably regional, changing, and diverse. Sanctuaries, tombs, ritual deposits, inscriptions, and images provide fragments. They do not provide one standardized Thracian theology. And this is precisely where modern myth-making can take over.
When evidence grows quiet, imagination becomes loud. Sometimes the most responsible reconstruction is the one that leaves a door open. Meanwhile, politics refused to stand still. In the early 3rd century BCE, Celtic groups swept through the Balkans. Some crossed into Anatolia and became known as the Galatians. Others established themselves for a time in Thrace, including a kingdom centered at Tylis. The map fractured again. Thracian dynasts, Hellenistic rulers, Greek cities, Celtic groups, temporary alliances, competing centers of power. No Thracian monarchy permanently recovered the reach associated with the greatest Odrysian kings. Then another power entered the Balkans, Rome. But Rome did not arrive in Thrace in a single cinematic moment, with one army crossing one frontier and an old world ending overnight. Its influence accumulated almost by layers. First, the Roman Republic defeated Macedon and became impossible to ignore in Balkan politics. Then Roman decisions reached farther into the disputes of local rulers. Thracian kings could be allies, rivals, clients, or intermediaries, still wearing crowns, but operating inside a political landscape whose center of gravity was moving steadily toward Rome. The change could be seen in small things before it was visible on a provincial map. Coins could advertise Roman connections. Dynastic quarrels could draw Roman intervention. Thracian soldiers entered Roman service. Roads, commerce, diplomacy, and military recruitment tied the region more closely to the expanding Roman system. The old world did not simply surrender and disappear. There was resistance, negotiation, compromise, and adaptation. Local rulers still maneuvered. Communities preserved regional identities.
But every generation had to make its choices under a balance of power increasingly set elsewhere. By the 1st century CE, that long pressure had reached the final Thracian client kingdom. Dynastic instability weakened it. After the death of Metalces III during the reign of Emperor Claudius, Rome abolished the monarchy. In 46 CE, Thrace was organized as a Roman province. For the old royal system, this was an ending. For the people living in Thrace, it was another transformation. The same geography that had attracted Persia and Macedon now served Rome. Thrace remained one of the great corridors between the Danube, the Aegean, and the Bosporus. Imperial roads followed routes imposed by mountains, valleys, and rivers long before a Roman engineer arrived. Towns expanded. Soldiers continued to be recruited. Local cults entered new combinations with Greek and Roman religious traditions. The landscape remained strategically valuable because the landscape itself had not changed. And this is where the idea of disappearance becomes dangerous. Cultures do not vanish simply because a political border changes color. Roman Thrace was not the Thrace of Sitalces, but the kingdom of Sitalces had already been different from the Thrace encountered by Darius centuries before. Continuity did not mean remaining unchanged. Change did not mean immediate erasure. Under Roman rule, Thracian names, communities, cults, and regional traditions remained visible for centuries. Greek continued to dominate much of the written culture of the Eastern Balkans, while Latin played important roles in administration and the military. Then the changes accumulated more quietly than any conquest. A family moved to a town. A soldier served far from home. Citizenship altered legal identity. Migrants arrived. Communities intermarried. Imperial institutions reshaped daily life. Across generations, older identities mixed with newer ones until the boundaries became harder for us to trace. The language followed the same fading line. Eventually, the Thracian language disappears from the historical record. The moment when its last fluent speakers lived is unknown. There was no final decree, no last inscription announcing that the language ended here, no witness who recorded its final conversation. It simply becomes harder to hear. And then, it is gone from the written record. And perhaps that is the deepest reason Thrace feels lost. Egypt covered monuments with its own writing. Greek literature was copied and recopied across centuries. Rome left laws, histories, inscriptions, roads, cities, and an imperial name that survived long after the empire itself had changed beyond recognition. Thrace left us no comparable continuous voice, so reconstructing it is not the same as reconstructing Rome. With Rome, the problem is often abundance. Too many voices, too many monuments, too many versions of the same event. With Thrace, the evidence arrives in fragments that do not always speak the same language. A Greek writer may describe a barbarian, while archaeology reveals a royal court tied to markets across the Mediterranean. A myth may place Orpheus in the mountains, while an inscription offers only the name of a ruler. A tomb can preserve an entire ceremonial world and explain none of it. Each fragment has limits, but place them beside one another, and an outline begins to appear. A Greek historian tells us that Sitalces marched into Macedonia. A Persian royal inscription remembers Scudra. An Athenian image preserves the clothing of a Thracian horseman. A gold vessel carries artistic languages that crossed political borders. A painted tomb preserves a ceremony whose participants have lost their names. A bronze face looks back across more than 23 centuries. And beneath a quiet reservoir, the streets of Seuthopolis remain where they were built. Perhaps then, lost is not quite the right word. Thrace was never lost to the landscape. Its rivers still cross the Balkans. Burial mounds still rise above fields. Its metalwork survives in museums. Its rulers negotiated with Athens, lived beneath the shadow of Persia, confronted the expansion of Macedon, and later navigated the growing power of Rome. Its soldiers fought far from home. Its religious traditions entered the cultural worlds of Greece and Rome. Its cities occupied routes where Europe and Asia were never separate stories. The traces are everywhere. What disappeared was something more intimate. The Thracians' own long voice. We know how outsiders described them. We know how enemies estimated their armies. We know what elites placed beside the dead. We know the names of some kings. But when we ask the most human question, how did the Thracians understand themselves? The answer breaks into fragments again, and the film returns to where it began. Somewhere beneath the water, at Kaprinka. The geometry of Seuthopolis waits in darkness, a royal city we can map, date, model, and reconstruct on paper, but cannot simply walk through. Not today. Yet that darkness is not empty. Future discoveries may still alter the picture. A longer inscription, a sealed burial, a workshop, a sanctuary, a name where no name was expected. Any one of them could force part of this story to be rewritten. Because Thrace is not a finished story. It is still being assembled. Not from one surviving chronicle. From gold. From stone. From painted chambers. From drowned streets. From the faces of kings. And from the silence between them.